Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. Enough talking, it's time to act. Let's finance our aid for Ukraine from the Russian frozen assets, said the Polish Prime Minister on X. In response to dynamically changing circumstances around support for Ukraine and peace talks, Donald Tusk has presented a plan of action. More on that in just a moment, but first, the latest headlines. Ukrainians show firm support for their president after Donald Trump's scorning words regarding Zelenskyy. Slovakians to commemorate journalist's death with a protest in Bratislava. Polish farmer considers legal action against SpaceX after he finds debris of a failed vessel in his backyard. It is time to act, says Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, as Europe tries to play catch-up with U.S. President Donald Trump and his shortcut approach to peace in Ukraine. The Polish leader has proposed a concrete plan of action made up of 3 points. These include using frozen Russian assets to a large extent, boosting protection for Europe's eastern flank, and finally reorganizing the EU's finance to spend more on defense. Will these points resonate with the rest of Europe? Kazimierz Łysiak reports.
Meeting after meeting, summit after summit, the European Union is scrambling to find a unified approach to the US-led peace talks on Ukraine. But according to Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, the time for discussions has passed.
Enough talking, it's time to act. First, let's finance our aid for Ukraine from the Russian frozen assets. Second, let's strengthen air policing, the Baltic sentry and the EU borders with Russia. Third, let's swiftly adopt new fiscal rules to finance the EU security and defense. Now.
Tusk's proposal is the first concrete plan to have been laid out by a European leader since US President Donald Trump recently spoke with Russia's Vladimir Putin over the phone and accelerated the peace negotiations. While all of Tusk's points had been previously voiced by Warsaw, the context of that appeal has changed drastically.
Talks between U.S. Donald Trump administration with Russian seems maybe allies for what we can see had been really as an earthquake for European leaders. And it seems that we have found out that for today, we are not really protected enough without U.S. support.
Back in October 2024, Warsaw's call to exclude defense spending from the EU limits on budget deficit was rejected by the European Commission. After recent developments, the Commission has changed its mind.
I can announce that I will propose to activate the escape clause for defense investments. This will allow member states to substantially increase their defense expenditure.
Given the uncertainty of the peace negotiations and Donald Trump's blunt attitude towards Ukraine, EU countries seem to be more eager to increase defense spending than ever. Even Germany, which has long resisted the idea of loans on defense, is now calling for less restrictive regulations.
Aus meiner Sicht kann Deutschland akzeptieren.
Germany can accept it if we allow the member states if they want to spend more than 2% on their defense. This will not be blocked by the criteria we have in the European Union for state loan financing.
Donald Tusk's second point on increased air, border and sea protection was well received by the European bloc when Poland first proposed it late last year. But it's the use of more than 200 billion euro of frozen Russian assets to aid Ukraine, which the EU has difficulty agreeing on.
And I'm not really sure if the other European powers are willing to join this proposition. Probably they will have to be discussed with the American side because these are Americans who control Western financial markets.
Poland, the main transport hub for aid deliveries to Ukraine and the country which spends the most on defense percentage-wise in all of NATO, hopes to play an important role in the discussions on the end of the war. Can Donald Tusk's three-point plan be a step in that direction? The ball is in the court of European capitals. For TVP World, Kazimierz Łysiak.
Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has called on the European Union to mobilize frozen Russian assets to aid Ukraine's reconstruction efforts. While the leader of the Central European country has proposed stronger efforts to hit the Kremlin, Budapest has flagged it with the opposite by vetoing a rollover of sanctions. EU correspondent Angela Skujins has the latest from Brussels.
Inconsistencies have emerged across the European Union regarding how member states should approach Russia regarding that country's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. The most strident comments come from the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who has called for the EU to mobilise roughly 210 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets. Many here in Brussels see this as a move to strengthen Ukraine when it comes to ceasefire negotiations with Russia. TVP World asked the European Commission about the veracity and possibility of a move such as this at a press conference this afternoon. Here is what they had to say.
At EU level, we focus on using profits from immobilized assets of the Russian Central Bank. The use of frozen Russian and Belarusian assets is being discussed in detail with member states and with our international partners, including the US, in the framework of the REPO task force. So far, those are only discussions and no formal proposal has been tabled yet.
Hungary, on the other hand, has been the loudest detractor, with that country's foreign minister, Peter Szijjártó, taking to social media to announce that he will veto a rollover of EU sanctions targeting thousands of Russian individuals. That matter is expected to be voted on at a Foreign Affairs Council meeting on Monday. He said that he will not vote in favour of the move because it could hinder the ceasefire talks ongoing between Russia and Ukraine. Those foreign ministers from Hungary, Poland, as well as the total 27 EU member states will be in Brussels on Monday to hammer out the EU's position regarding these ongoing conflicts. Angela Skujins from Brussels for TVP World.
The geopolitical earthquake between Washington and Kyiv has sparked a series of speculations about the shape and future of the peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. Meanwhile, Ukraine is reeling from the aftermath of another night of sustained Russian attacks. We're joined by our correspondent Don Arleth. Good evening, Don. What does the situation look like after the recent attacks?
Well, overnight, 12 people were killed, 6 people were wounded, and of course, 160 drones sent here on the country, many of which were launched towards the capital. Another sleepless night for us last night as we see the air defense working every night trying to shoot these drones down. We actually saw one get shot down last night. But it looked like it was one of those decoy drones. Obviously, the air defense here in Kyiv is actually, we've been here for 6 days now. We've seen how it works. It's absolutely fantastic. But of course, this is something that Ukraine desperately needs assistance on. When we look at the past political events of this week, it's also been quite chaotic. I was told by a high-level source that the government is now referring only to President Zelenskyy. None of his administration is allowed to really comment on all those developments as far as, the Keith Kellogg visit. He's come and gone. And the tone is trying to calm down, if you will. We were at the Kiev Security Forum today, and I had an opportunity to speak with Arseniy Yatsenyuk. He's the former Prime Minister of Ukraine from 2014 to 2016. And while he had a lot of good ideas on how to proceed with the United States, I asked him what he would advise the administration if he was in that position. And here's what he told me.
Let's speak out who is the war criminal. Putin is a war criminal, he is a dictator. Zelenskyy is a legitimate president. The time will come when Ukraine is to hold free and fair elections, but the conditions have to be met. Only in 6 months after a comprehensive, full and fair peace agreement that has to be reached.
That's right. And of course, the question there of the elections, the latest poll saying, 57% of support of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Of course, there needs to be peace. There needs to be peace for 6 months. And then you can start thinking about elections. I talked to people on the streets today as well to get their opinion, as, we've seen this kind of snowball effect between the back and forth between the Trump administration and Zelenskyy. And just tried to get their feeling and general mood. Let's take a listen.
Well, we think that Trump is on the Russian side, and it really scares us.
No peace without Ukraine, because Ukraine is a victim, and we should and we must make decisions what to do with our country.
I think that we can't trust Donald Trump in all that he talk or said about us and about our part in this peace talk. I think that we need to trust only in our mental values and don't follow others' provocations.
Of course, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. That's what you really hear from everybody here in Ukraine. And well, we're hoping that next week will bring some better developments. Now back to you.
Thank you, Don, and please stay safe. That was Donald Arleth reporting from Kyiv. Slovakians have taken to the streets across the country on Friday to mark 7 years since the murder of a young investigative journalist, Ján Kuciak, and his fiancée. But these rallies are more than an act of remembrance for the killed couple. They are also a vote of no confidence for the current Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico. Our correspondent Paweł Trzaskowski is in Bratislava with more. Hello, Paweł. From what I can gather, the protests are already over. So what can you tell us about what took place?
Well, indeed, the protests in Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, have already finished. They lasted for a bit more than 1 hour. And when I asked the main organizer of today's demonstrations about the surprising duration of these protests, he told me that this is a part of a protest culture in Slovakia, that the demonstrations are brief, they are orderly, safe, but persistent. And when I asked him about the reason for today's protests, this is the answer that I got from him.
We are against our prime minister because our prime minister decided to take Slovakia to Russia. It means that he's looking only for a relationship with Mr. Putin, and we are really we as Slovaks feel that we have to protect our country and be part of the European Union and NATO, and to be aligned with our partners in Europe. And Mr. Fico is working everything against it, so we don't like it.
All in all, protests on such a scale have been unseen in Slovakia since the Velvet Revolution of 1989. However, it all changed 7 years ago with the murder of investigative journalist Ján Kuciak and his partner. And the protests that started then forced Prime Minister Fico to resign from his post. The organizers of these protests that started in January this year are hoping to achieve the same result. Back to you, Claudia.
Paweł Trzaskowski, live from Bratislava. German Conservative frontrunner Friedrich Merz and high-ranking SPD candidate Boris Pistorius are both in Western Germany today, rallying supporters in a last push before the nation heads to the polls. With the election just days away, the mood is tense, the stakes are high, and voters are weighing up the key issues. Sasha Farbach takes the pulse of the nation live from Hanover. Good evening, Sasha. So what have you learned on the ground? What's important for voters in Germany?
Hi, Claudia. So we really have been taking the pulse. We were early in East Germany this morning in Dresden, making a tour, asking people there, and then also coming here today to Hanover, one of these main cities in Western Germany, and asking people what matters to them. Now, it's a range of issues. Now, it also depends on who you ask, and it's not just one issue that matters. So we went through the different streets, we talked to locals, we talked to young and old, and let's just share some of those insights. What matters to Germans?
For me, it's important that we don't move further to the right. That's actually the most important thing at the moment. There's a lot of talk about security, and climate has pretty much fallen by the wayside in this election. I just don't think it's been given enough attention.
I think Ukraine definitely needs help. I see that very clearly. But I also believe that something needs to change in Germany's migration policy. It can't go on like this without slipping into a blatant right-wing tendency.
So we have various views from Ukraine, security, about what might happen next with the climate. So a real hodgepodge of different ideas. And that was the same also when we traveled earlier from the east of the country. Now, what matters as well is, remember, very likely it will be that Friedrich Merz, the head of the conservative, the CDU party, will likely have enough votes to become chancellor, around 30%. But he'll might have to govern with someone else. So we also asked an expert here at Hanover University about what key issues might be important for Germany. What's next? How could Friedrich Merz affect that? So let's take a listen to what the professor told us.
Friedrich Merz has sided with Ukraine much more decisively than our current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. So we should expect a very vocal support for Ukraine and also for further weapons delivery to help them defend the country. German politics has seen a massive transformation in the last years and actually taking a much more active role in security policy across the European continent. And over the last days, we've seen German leaders condemn the statements by President Donald Trump and his Vice President J.D. Vance. However, Friedrich Merz, the assumptive Chancellor, has been, somewhat reluctant to fully condemn this.
So there we have also, it matters what happens here in Germany. As we know, the conflicts going on in Ukraine right now, Germany is expected to do more. Now, what people will choose, that's what's the ticket big item here in the next few days. Some have already voted by postal ballot. Some are still undecided. So it's the next few days with smaller parties now pulling up to the front. Remember, there's that 5% threshold for parties that they have to get to. So that might be a deciding factor going forward. We'll have to wait and see. But so far, one conclusion is that many people are curious. There's a mix of optimism, but people do want change. And we'll see. We'll keep covering it. We'll be in Berlin tomorrow. Claudia, back to you in the studio.
Thank you so much, Sasha Forbach, reporting from Hanover. Another underwater cable sabotaged by adversaries or an unfortunate accident. That is the probe of an investigation launched by Swedish authorities on Friday morning. It comes just as European leaders gather in Helsinki to discuss bolstering defense around the Baltic Sea.
Ulf Christensen took to social media on Friday morning to announce Sweden is launching an investigation into the breach of an undersea cable in the Baltic Sea.
I've been aware for some time of the media reports about a possible new cable break in the Baltic Sea. The government is being kept informed by the relevant authorities who are investigating what has happened. We take all reports of possible damaged infrastructure in the Baltic Sea very seriously. As I said earlier, they must be seen in the context of the serious security situation that exists.
The investigation is currently focused on Sweden's eastern coastline.
The breakage was found off of the Swedish island of Gotland, and it falls under the Swedish economic zone. So the cable was running between Germany and Finland, but because it's in the economic zone of Sweden, both the Swedish police and the Swedish Coast Guard are investigating.
EU representatives gathered in Helsinki on Friday morning, vowing to bolster the security of underwater cable infrastructure in response to the suspected sabotage attempts in recent months.
We will also work to launch a dedicated dual surveillance drones program covering both air and underwater drones. That's why first the creation of an EU cable vessel reserve to increase the EU's capacity to repair damaged cables. Second, we will also support the establishment of strategic reserves for the main cable spare parts.
The situation appears to be growing more precarious. Less than a month ago, Sweden seized a Malta-flagged bulk carrier suspected of damaging a fiber optic cable between Latvia and Sweden. The NATO alliance reacted in kind to the infrastructure sabotage attempts, launching the Baltic Sentry safeguarding mission in January.
It's focused deterrence throughout the Baltic Sea with the mission of countering destabilizing acts. And that's coming straight from SACEUR, from the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And, the language that was used is ability to rapidly respond to such destabilization. And I think rapid is the key word.
Securing the Baltic Sea's infrastructure is an increasingly pressing issue. In late December, Finnish authorities boarded an oil tanker traveling from Russia on suspicion it had damaged an undersea power cable and 3 internet links connecting Finland and Estonia.
using more drones, either underwater drones or air drones, to patrol the Baltic Sea more carefully. So it seems both in the EU, in NATO, and in the Baltic countries, there's a fairly intense conversation about what kinds of security measures can be done.
And the issue is no small feat to address. According to reports, in the past 15 months, 11 Baltic Sea cables have been damaged. And despite the initiative to bolster defense in the region, underwater infrastructure remains vulnerable.
A SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket launched on February 1st from California's Vandenberg Space Force Base made an unexpected re-entry into the atmosphere, its pieces scattering over Polish soil. A local farmer is now considering legal action against SpaceX, while experts call for an FAA investigation into the mishap that left charred debris and stunned eyewitnesses in its wake.
Emergency services are working on the site where pieces of SpaceX Falcon 9 fell to the ground. A Polish farmer is considering legal action against SpaceX after debris crashed onto his farm. Pieces of the rocket fell in several areas. In the village of Komorniki near Poznań, western Poland, a gas tank fell on a local company's premises.
There were black pieces knocked down everywhere. Well, and one big black spot where the poles are. This was cleaned up by the hazardous material response team who came here. There, under the fence, this tank was found.
SpaceX rocket debris falling on Polish soil is something that should warrant an FAA investigation, said Dr. Piotr Witek from the Copernicus Science Center in Warsaw, talking to TVP World.
It is something that in different times should warrant an investigation by FAA. I don't know will it happen nowadays, now that Elon Musk is so important figure close to the government. Still, the matter of safety is important for the majority of players, and there are many mechanisms to help deorbit spent rocket bodies and other debris from the orbit. And this time it was there, but it simply didn't work as intended.
The Falcon 9's re-entry into the atmosphere over Poland was recorded by eyewitnesses. The rocket was launched on February 1st from the Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, carrying 22 Starlink satellites into orbit.
Boosting Europe's defense industry is a key goal, yet the competing national interests and funding issues could pose a challenge to realizing this ambition. Now, with the US changing its stance on its involvement in European security, the EU is considering using frozen Russian assets to finance support for Ukraine and its own defense industry in face of increasing tensions. Joining me now to discuss this is Tomasz Włostowski, managing partner at the EU Strategies.
Hello, how are you?
Good evening and welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining. I would like to start by taking a look at a social media post that was posted on X by Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. He said, I quote, "Enough talking, it's time to act. 1, let's finance our aid for Ukraine from the Russian frozen assets. 2, let's strengthen air policing, the Baltic Sentry and the EU borders with Russia. And finally, 3, let's swiftly adopt new fiscal rules to finance the EU security and defense now." So before touching the frozen Russian assets seemed to be a no-go, a big no-no. It posed many challenges. According to some, it was too complicated or even too risky. What has changed that the EU is now considering such move?
Well, obviously, what's changed is that the end of the war and the end of American support is on the horizon, right? So I think that's the key game changer right now, and Europe needs to start thinking how to finance the war, how to help Ukraine in the very short window that we have. Of course, we don't know how short the window is. We don't know how quickly President Trump wants to finish sort of U.S. involvement in this whole affair and in supporting Ukraine. But there's a clear sense in Europe and in Brussels in particular that the time is running out. So we need to really revisit all the options that we've discarded before and find any ways we can to support Ukraine. And of course, having these billions and billions of Russian assets is sort of a natural direction to go because A, there's a lot of money that we have. 2, it's Russian money, and who's to blame for all the damage and for all the destruction and for all the deaths in Ukraine? It's the Russians. So obviously, using Russian assets to do that would be sort of a natural way to go. There have been legal sort of problems raised with confiscating these assets and using it for Ukraine reconstruction, but I think sort of the patience with the lawyers in finding a way to use them is running thin.
So do you think it is possible to quickly put in place some sort of a legislation that would actually allow the use of those frozen assets? What kind of procedures are we looking at that would have to be introduced to do so legally?
Well, I think we're looking at a couple of different issues. So the first issue is we've got frozen assets of the Russian Federation, of the Russian Central Bank. That's sort of one bulk of assets. And then we've got the sort of the private assets. So we've got the assets of Russian oligarchs, of Russian natural persons, politicians, executives, directors, business people, and so on. And we've got assets of Russian companies. So there's a clear distinction between the public assets and the private assets. There's a general feeling we shouldn't be using private assets because they're private. Although, if we think about, whose assets have we frozen, these people, at least under EU law, are not exactly quote unquote innocent. I mean, there's a reason why we froze their assets. And the reason why we have frozen their assets is because they have been, in one way or another, involved in supporting or benefiting from the war, right? So these are not innocent people, after all, the people whose assets we've frozen. But that said, we're still sort of trying to avoid using these assets, and the whole focus is on Russian government's assets. What would need to happen is basically we would need to confiscate them. Now, legally, that's quite complicated. I think the much easier path would be to allow Ukrainian government or Ukrainian entities or Ukrainian people basically to file claims against these assets. That, at least in my personal view, I think that's much easier, because let's keep in mind that the assets that are frozen, we can already execute judgments against them. So if we have frozen assets of the Russian Federation or of Russian companies, and you come with a judgment from a court to execute against those assets, that's already possible right now. What we can't do, and we don't have right now, are the judgments against the Russians for the damage they've caused in Ukraine. So, it's a complicated issue how to circumvent that problem. And also the second thing is how to circumvent Russian sovereign immunity. It's a general concept in international public law that the assets of another government, of another country, are sort of immune from execution, from lawsuits. So we would need to sort of circumvent that problem, and I think that's some sort of a mental difficulty that most of the lawyers have.
It seems to be the case that upping the European security has to happen now, as the U.S. is focusing on its own priorities, as we've seen from what's been happening in the U.S. so far and internationally as well. Changes need to happen now. How long do you think it would take to have those frozen assets work for the EU defense, for supporting Ukraine? I mean, in the first minutes of our interview, you mentioned that we're working with a very short window.
Well, look, again, to be very frank, I find it difficult to imagine we're going to use the Russian assets for European defense. I mean, that is going to be, there are just too many hurdles for that, so I'm quite skeptical that is going to happen. I think what's much more likely to happen is finding some way of using those assets to help Ukraine rebuild or rearm itself. And that's probably sort of an easier path to go. Again, I think we're talking months and months. I mean, this is not going to happen in a week or 2 weeks. I mean, this is what we need. What we would need to do is pass legislation in Europe. That's number one. And number two, I'm suspecting we will not do that unless we have some type of a signal from the Russians that that's okay with them. I find it difficult to imagine that Europe would do it completely sort of, in light of complete Russian opposition. And what I'm getting at here is I think the proper way to go would be that the Americans, as part of their negotiations with the Russians, would agree with the Russians that some part of a global settlement and freeze or suspension of the war would also include Europeans using the frozen assets for reconstruction of Ukraine, because that would solve one of the big stumbling blocks in finding a peace that would be acceptable to Ukraine. Because one thing is cessation of hostilities, another issue is finding security guarantees for Ukraine, and the third prong is rebuilding Ukraine. And at least if the Russians agreed, or at least tacitly agreed, or signaled their agreement to using the frozen assets for that, we would solve at least one problem.
We've seen this plan, this very short but very concise plan from Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk on his X account, and we know that Poland actually holds the presidency over the EU Council. Do you think that these two things coming up together are actually capable of giving fruit to some results? Is Poland going to be that trigger that is going to push this whole procedure forward?
Well, absolutely. I think, and that's probably one of the reasons why the Prime Minister put that tweet out, because I think he does want to put the pressure, number one, on the High Representative, Kaja Kallas, and her External Action Service, who are sort of in charge of the foreign affairs and the sanctions file in Brussels, to sort of look at that. We know that Kaja Kallas, in general, she is quite supportive of using Russian assets. So the problem is not at the political level, the problem is on the technical, legal level. But I think to answer your question precisely, the answer is yes. Poland will definitely be pushing it, and it's in a key position to allow that to happen.
What do you think is going to be Donald Trump's stance on Europe actually wanting to use those frozen assets? Considering the conversations that he's having with Moscow, with Vladimir Putin, do you think he's going to support this idea, or maybe rather he's going to backtrack from it, depending on what Vladimir Putin actually is going to tell him?
Look, and this is the million-dollar question, which is what does Trump really want? And I'm not going to speculate on what he's actually after. I'm not really sure that he knows at this point what he's really after, to be honest. But I think the key point is this: the Americans want out. I think that's very clear. And some way of using Russian assets to achieve that is a way to sort of achieve both goals. On the one hand, if we solve this problem, and that's why I've mentioned it earlier, once we solve this problem, it's much easier for the Americans to extricate themselves from supporting Ukraine in this war. So naturally, I would imagine that Donald Trump should be supportive of it because it solves a couple of his problems. Now, the main issue, of course, is, as you suggested, whether Putin would agree or not. But we haven't seen Americans put any pressures on the Russians yet. I think this has been the main complaint, and this has been the main commentary, that there's a lot of concessions vis-a-vis the Ukrainians, and that the Ukrainians are supposed to undertake. We have not yet seen one element of putting the pressure on the Russians. So perhaps getting a Russian agreement to confiscate, to use those assets for reconstruction of Ukraine would be part of the puzzle.
Thank you so much, Tomasz Włostowski, Managing Partner at the EU Strategies. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And so this would be all for now here on World News Tonight, but please do stay tuned. We're back in just a moment with more news and features.